Prince William is there with Kylie Minogue in tow. Keir Starmer is there. But Donald Trump of the US, Xi Jinping of China, and Narendra Modi of India are not there. Does that mean this year's UN climate change conference, which is happening now in Brazil, is going to be a washout? We'll discuss that on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and shortly I'll be joined by Alex Forsyth, who's been looking at what Reform UK have been up to in those English councils they seized control of in the last local elections, and also what that might mean for a Reform government if there was one. But first of all, we're going to head straight to Belém on the edge of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, which is playing host to the latest United Nations annual climate change conference known as COP. We're at the stage of the event where lots of world leaders and VIPs are flying in, although with some crucial exceptions. The VIPs we got for you today are Prince William, who's just been hosting his Earthshot Prize and giving a speech to the delegates, and Keir Starmer, who has just been doing a speech to the delegates too. And the person who's been watching those speeches unfold is the BBC's climate editor, Justin Rowlatt, who is there. Hi, Justin.
It's this is where the conference is taking place. It's quite chaotic here. The leaders are arriving. We've literally just heard Prince William speak. We've heard Sir Keir Starmer speak. Lula's spoken. We've got Antonio Guterres as well. So lots of leaders. The big opening speeches designed to set the tone for this giant conference right on the edge of the Amazon rainforest.
And Justin, is it chaotic because it's a chaotic thing, or is it chaotic just because there's lots of heads of state and government and VIPs there all at the same time?
It's chaotic because the leaders have arrived before the conference actually opens, and the conference centre, which is huge, literally the main corridor is like a huge kind of colon running through the middle of this conference. It's more than half a mile long, so it's absolutely massive, and it hasn't been finished. So there are builders working all around us, and the bits they have finished is where the world leaders are. So it's chaotic because of that. And look, you've been here before. It's always chaotic. You know, I can't remember the actual number of world leaders. It's like 57 or something. Hard to count. But, you know, that's a lot of world leaders. They bring their own entourages. They bring their own security and that kind of thing. So, you know, managing these huge events is tricky, and it does make it a bit chaotic. A little delay when you've got, I think, the list of speakers ran to well over 100. And when you've got that many people speaking, if someone runs over, it ripples down and causes problems for everyone else. So we are delayed. The feed that we were supposed to get here in our office wasn't working, makes it very hard to report the story if you can't see what anyone's saying. So all the, frankly, Adam, you've been here before, all the usual kind of problems you get at these giant international conferences.
Yeah, also joining us is our senior royal correspondent, Daniela Relph. Hi, Daniela.
Hi, Adam.
And so you're in Rio, so you're not deep in the Amazon rainforest or on the edge of the Amazon rainforest, and that's where Prince William was earlier this week.
I can't complain. It's a rather nice place to be. I mean, just to add a little bit of background on the chaos of COP, can I just, a little bit of media background just this morning that's happened. I don't think I'm breaking any confidences saying this, but to pick up what Justin said is that a group of royal reporters have gone down to Belém from Rio. We decided to stay here in Rio as we felt it was easier to work and broadcast from here. But that group that has gone down and flew in this morning wasn't able to get into COP for ages and ages and ages. They were circling in a minibus around because there was so much chaos around the leaders, and as Justin says, their entourage is arriving. I think they actually got in with about a minute to spare before Prince William started speaking, having flown there for that moment this morning. So you can imagine there is a little bit of sort of administrative chaos around COP, I would say.
Okay, that's the processology. Let's talk about the substance. Daniela, what was Prince William saying in his address to COP? And also, what should we make of the fact that it's him doing the addressing rather than the king?
Right. I mean, his team have said this is the most important environmental speech Prince William has delivered. And as you say, there's a little bit of a generational change going on here within the royal family. It would, of course, normally be his father who would come to COP and deliver some kind of opening keynote speech. This time, those reins have been passed to William. You know, the king is now in his late 70s. He is still undergoing cancer treatments, and I think it was felt that it was perhaps too much for him to travel halfway around the world to deliver that speech, and also because Prince William's Earthshot Prize had been set up for the 3 days ahead of COP. So it all fitted neatly together in terms of William delivering this speech here today at COP. But we know that he had talked to his father about what he would say. They'd worked together on it, that the king had read this speech before it was delivered. So it was an element, perhaps a little bit of joint enterprise there. But the themes of it were very much the sort of stuff we hear from William when he talks about the environment. He has this evergreen theme of urgent optimism, which is, to try and look for solutions, feel there is something that still can be done here. And it was very much why his Earthshot Prize was set up 5 years ago. He felt clearly there was a bit of negativity in the environment space, that he wanted to focus on what could still be done rather than what wasn't being done. And that was very much the mood of what he delivered today at COP.
And then, Justin, just as we're speaking now at 4:10 on Thursday afternoon, Starmer's just given his speech. What did you make of what the Prime Minister had to say?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, in many ways, it echoed what the Prince said. He talked about the urgent need, Keir Starmer, that is, talked about the urgent need to tackle climate change. He said the UK government is all in on the effort. He talked about, the effort to switch to renewable power that's happening in Britain, the jobs they claim will be created by all of that. He also talked about, being on the edge of the Amazon and the need to protect the rainforest. But interestingly, the signature policy for the President of Brazil, President Lula, for this conference is a forest fund to support the Amazon, a $125 billion fund he wants to set up. And he was hoping, he had the bowl out, he was hoping to get donations from the countries that have turned up here. But Sir Keir Starmer has said that given the cost of living crisis in Britain, the UK will not be putting any money into that fund. And it presents quite an irony, actually, because only last night Prince William was awarding one of these Earthshot Prizes, £1 million towards the effort to protect those forests. So we've got this ironic position that actually Prince William has given more than the Prime Minister of the UK.
Oh, Daniela, that's quite unusual to have the royal family and the government having a slightly different position. I mean, okay, you can exaggerate these things, but that is an interesting little kind of wrinkle in our constitution.
Yeah, absolutely. There is that little bit of conflict there, and it comes because we've had the Earthshot Prize literally butt joined up to COP, and you can see those areas where perhaps there is a little bit of a mismatch and a wrinkle, as you put it. And as Justin said, that was one of them. Having a nominee last night who seems to be slightly in conflict with what is going on and what has been delivered by the British government. It is not something you are going to get Prince William to comment on. He is very wary of the politics of the environment and how he wants to sort of stay out of that space and be much more a cheerleader around it. Whether that's going to be possible in the long term, a bit harder to say, but that is his position.
And Justin, in terms of what this COP is going to achieve, you talked about President Lula trying to raise money for his big forest initiative, the UK not heeding the call. Are there other kind of side projects that are quite big there this year?
There's another big financial project, which is, they call it the Baku in Azerbaijan held COP29, the previous COP, the Baku to Belém roadmap, they call it, trying to work out how to raise the money that was committed last year. $1.3 trillion a year by 2035 is what they want to raise, huge amount of money. The roadmap to delivering that cash. Now that's a huge amount of money, very ambitious. Developed countries said back in Baku that they'd only raised $300 billion of that, so the rest needs to come from kind of private sector sources, that kind of thing. So one of the things is and crucially here, to give a plausible outline of how such a fund might be raised, that it's not just nebulous commitments made by people that will never materialize, real cash. So that's one of the ambitions. We've got the Forest Fund, but more generally it's quite interesting what the Brazilians are saying about this conference is they call it, they're saying that it's the implementation COP, the opportunity for countries to turn the promises they've made over the years and decades at these conferences into action. They're saying now's the time to deliver, and we want to see that delivery happening here. But it is a kind of, and they claim that is one of the big outcomes, but it's hard to see how they can make that ring true, given that so few, just a few dozen world leaders have turned up here, and three of the biggest emitters in the world, China, India, and the US, haven't turned up at all. So a tough call to say multilateralism's working and we can deliver on the promises to tackle climate change that countries have made, when so many countries, frankly, haven't bothered to send their leaders here, haven't bothered really to turn up.
Yeah, and also the fact that Presidents Trump, Xi, and Modi are not there. Does that mean they're not contributing to the the goal either. It's not just that they're not there, like their countries are kind of
Well,
a bit missing in action too.
Well, no, the Chinese have sent a big delegation, and they've sent the deputy prime minister. They will be working hard to come to agreements to work on these goals that the Brazilians have set out, and this effort to reaffirm the power of multilateralism. India will be here too. They tend to play a slightly less prominent role, but they'll be here too. The really interesting party there is America. Trump, as you may remember, wielded his Sharpie on day one of his presidency and withdrew yet again. He did it last time he was president, withdrew America from the Paris Agreement. America's still technically part of this. They could send a delegation. He said they're not sending any high-level representatives from America, but we've seen a couple of recent UN conferences. The agreements that were proposed there, one on shipping and one on plastics, were derailed, were torpedoed by the Americans, who lobbied opposition in those negotiations. So the fear here has been that Trump may wield some of that power and influence America has to rally some of the countries, Russia, Saudi Arabia, that aren't keen on seeing action on climate change, may rally them to try and derail any negotiations that look as if they're going to be successful. We haven't seen a hint of that yet. We haven't seen the US delegation, but that is something that may happen and is causing a lot of anxiety among the diplomats here.
And of course, the thing about COPs is they work on the basis of consensus, that everyone in the room has to agree for something to be decided.
Absolutely, yeah. They work on consensus. These awful compromises that we've discussed in previous newscasts, where people are looking at literally, the wording and exact precise wording and the different meaning of shall or could and all these different words. So they're incredibly complex negotiations, and they can quite easily be upset when a couple of parties start to make things difficult. So it may be hard to get some of these things across the line in what is already, as I say, a very kind of challenging COP. Lots of people around the world saying, hold on a second, renewable power's racing ahead in the sunny developing countries around the world. Massive investment in renewables. That's happening kind of away from the diplomatic negotiators. They look at that and say, well, hold on, what's the point of these kind of huge circuses of diplomacy if in the real world action's happening because people are saying this technology makes sense, it's profitable for me to do this. So it's a difficult time. It could be a kind of fork in the road, an inflection point for the entire diplomatic process. We'll see as this COP unfolds.
And Justin, I'm reading into what you're saying there. It's too soon to basically sound the death knell for limiting the increase in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees on average by the end of the century, which is kind of the most ambitious goal.
I was certainly trying to do that. I was also trying to suggest it might be worth coming back to us a bit later on, find out how things are going.
Definitely. We'll take you up on that offer. And Daniela, before we go, here's your chance to be showbiz reporter now. How was Prince William as an award show host, although he wasn't hosting the whole thing? And how did Kylie Minogue and Shawn Mendes do?
I'm here for all showbiz news, Adam. I mean, Kylie, as a Brit in that audience last night, was absolutely fantastic. She played a medley of songs, Padam Padam, Can't Get You Out of My Head, and then did Celebrate, the old Kool and the Gang song at the end to close out the show. She was a real pro. I have to say, I'm not sure how well-known Kylie is in Brazil. A lot of the Brazilian journalists I was sitting with did not know who she was and were much more interested in Anita, who opened the show, who was a kind of sort of Brazilian Kylie maybe-ish. I'm not quite sure.
No, I think she's bigger. She's bigger.
Yes, yeah, I think so. There was a little bit of a discrepancy in terms of how the two musical performances were received. And then Shawn Mendes, he performed in the middle of the show. Quite a subdued performance, I would say, but his mum, Shawn Mendes' mum, Karen, is British. And earlier in the day, yesterday, she's here in Rio, Prince William took her a birthday cake because it was her birthday, we understand. So a nice little behind-the-scenes personal touch there. But yeah, generally, the show was, very glossy, very glitzy, had some really lovely Brazilian elements. Prince William delivered a pretty powerful speech, again, the same themes of his COP speech, urgent optimism, generational change, those are what he talked about. And the whole thing, was incredibly optimistic and hopeful.
Wow, excellent showbiz reporting as well as royal correspondenting as well. Daniela, thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam.
And Justin, thanks for some excellent climate editing as well.
Thank you, cheers.
Now, as promised, earlier on I spoke to Alex Forsyth in the other newscast studio because she has written an in-depth piece for the BBC News website about what she's learnt about how Reform UK are getting on in those councils that they're in charge of in England and what we can surmise about what a reform government nationwide might look like as a result.
Hello, Alex.
Hello.
Now, obviously, I've read your BBC in-depth
Glad
piece.
to hear it.
Just pretend that I haven't read it, right? What's your theory here? What's the concept?
So the concept is, I guess, two key points. The first thing is that Reform went into the local elections promising it would find lots and lots of savings in local councils. And I think it's safe to say what they've encountered is the kind of reality of the financial pressure on local government. And the second one is that what they are finding is that they're really in quite a similar position to many of the parties that preceded them.
Well, let's focus on the first one first. I suppose the big flagship council they control is Kent, and lots of newscasters will have seen a leaked recording of a very fiery council meeting, which has led to several Reform UK councillors being chucked out of the party. What was that meeting actually about?
So this was, to be clear, a private discussion meeting between the Reform councillors within Kent. So it wasn't like an official business council meeting, but there was a video of it that was leaked, and what they were talking about, as far as I can ascertain, were two issues in particular where it all got a bit tense. One of them is about local government reorganisation. So in plain speak, the government's got a plan to change the kind of way that councils run and how they look and what areas they control, like the structure. And in lots of areas, this is not limited to Reform, that's proving really thorny. The other one was the budget, because where we are right now is that councils are starting to look at the budgets that are going to kick in from April next year. And right across the country, councils of all political colours are finding that really tough, because the backdrop is that councils have had their budget squeezed for a really long time, and lots of the services they provide, the cost of those is going up and up. So they were the two areas that seemed to be the thorniest in this meeting. And then the leader, Lyndon Kemp-Carran, she shouted and swore at some of her own councillors on that meeting, a private meeting. It got leaked. There was all this fallout. And because Reform itself has said that Kent is its flagship council, a sort of shop window to, reform in local government, I think that's why this got so much attention.
And today, as we're recording this on Thursday, the 6th of November, a fifth Reform councillor has been kicked out of the party as a result of that meeting. It's Isabella Kemp, who was the chair of the Adult Social Care and Public Health Cabinet Committee in Kent.
Yeah, and Lyndon Kemp-Carran herself has sort of said, look, it's business as usual. I'm not going anywhere. She's the leader of Kent County Council. And, I think it is really fair to say that I've covered local government for a lot of years, and there are clearly tensions that happen in all parties at every level of politics, really. But it was the fact that this one was made public, the fact that, like I say, Kent has held Reform has held Kent up as its sort of, example of how it runs local government. And remember that this is a party that hasn't been tested in any form of government at all before. So people are looking really closely at the way it runs local authorities in particular, because it's a sort of first test of Reform with its hands on the reins of power.
And I suppose, in a nutshell, what's happened in Kent is that two big things have collided. One of them being this whole Doge idea modelled on the Elon Musk Department of Government Efficiency in the US. So a big kind of cost-cutting measure. But also the second thing, the very expensive things, as you were insinuating, that local authorities are obliged to provide under the law. And in Kent, those two things have smashed right into each other.
Not just in Kent, actually. In most of the so it's in the other Reform councils as well. So they took outright control of 10 councils at the elections in May, but they run a couple more than that now. And when they did win those elections, not long after that, they set up this Doge unit, this Department of Government Efficiency style unit. And they said initially they were actually going to go round to councils and send this team of sort of software experts and data analysts in and look through the books and find hundreds of millions of pounds worth of savings. But what's happened is that unit's run into some legal problems in accessing council data, which can be really sensitive, so they haven't been able to do that in lots of these councils. So some of these Reform-led authorities have set up their own departments of local government efficiency. That's what the Kent team call theirs. But as you say, that what they are discovering is that because councils have to provide certain services, and in particular adult social care and children's services, and the demand for those services has gone up and up and up, and the cost of the providing them has gone up and up and up, they're finding that actually the room to try and materialise all of these savings that they've promised is really limited. Now, I spoke to Zia Youssef, who's Reform's head of policy, who was running this Doge unit up until last month. And he said, look, we have still managed to find hundreds of millions of pounds worth of savings. We're going to give you more detail on exactly what they are. They've pointed to a few things like cancelling some net zero projects. And they said that we're going to hear more about it. But there's also lots of people that are real experts in local government. They've looked at this sector for a long time. And what they see is the thing is that's not going to meet the scale of the financial challenge that councils are facing because of that pressure on the services that they have to provide by law in particular.
And there's that great quote in your piece from Stuart Hoddinott from the Institute for Government think tank, who says it's like somebody earning 30 grand a year thinking about 2 pence.
Yeah, and Reform, they recognise it. Zia Youssef, again, he did say to me that, councils are facing, in his words, overwhelming demands from Whitehall, and that's kind of part of the problem. And people like Stuart Hoddinott and Tony Travers, who's another person that follows local government really closely, he's from the London School of Economics, they do recognise that this system of local government has been under strain for a huge amount of time. In fact, one of them said to me that Reform's walked into a broken system because for a lot of years, the government has increased the amount of funding it gives to councils this year, and it's actually just trying to work out a new way of delving up council funding for next year. But the backdrop to all this is a period where councils' budgets did go down for quite a long time while the pressure on services went up. And they've got kind of limited levers they can pull to generate their own income. So they can look at council tax, but, they rely quite a lot on money that they get from government. So there are lots of people that say, actually, this whole system just needs a huge rethink, and Reform have sort of walked into this. But the problem for Reform is obviously what they were saying was that they would find lots and lots of savings, they'd find lots of efficiency, they'd find lots of waste, and they would keep taxes low. And I think that is proving challenging for the party, and I think the party would acknowledge that. Now, it's worth saying that Richard Tice, who is Reform's deputy leader, he's just taken over that Doge, that Department of Government Efficiency Unit. And I spoke to him as well, and he told me that he was looking at things like local government pension schemes and waste-related contracts and property, and he was still confident they could find lots and lots of savings, again, saying the detail of those would come in kind of future weeks or months. But I think it's fair and true to say that when it comes to budgets in particular, Reform now have found themselves confronted with the same set of challenges that their parties that went before them had.
Although I noticed from reading your piece that your conversation with Richard Tice came with a big disclaimer from him, which is, we Reform didn't promise to cut council tax. We promised to limit the increases in council tax.
Yeah, this is actually a really important thing, and I don't want to bore our newscasters with too much council tax level detail, but really in broad terms.
Alex, you've been on this podcast for years. Okay. You know that's not possible.
All right, I love it. But in kind of broad terms, the government tells councils how much they can put council tax up by, and it's normally around 5% for the councils that provide social care and children's services, has been in recent years. And most councils put their council tax up by that amount because the reasons we talked about, that the sector's been under quite a lot of financial strain. So there's been this big debate with Richard Tice and other senior figures saying they never promised to cut council tax, but they did talk about keeping taxes down. And in some areas, some opposition councillors say that locally there were people in Reform who were saying that they would cut council tax, although Richard Tice is insistent that the leadership of the party never made that promise. But the reality, with all of that aside, is that these councils led by Reform, as are the other councils led by other parties, they are looking at council tax increases. I've been through the budget papers of some of the councils, and a lot of them do consultations while they're setting their budgets to get public thoughts on it. And they're talking about council tax increases of up to 5%. In one council, Worcestershire, they're asking people what they view about a council tax increase of above that, up to 10%. Now, the Reform leadership there say they don't want to do that, but they're just consulting people on their views to see if they'd be willing to pay a bit more because of the financial pressure on councils. So that's the kind of bigger picture. But what both Zia Youssef and Richard Tice said to me was that it was their hope, it's the decision of local councils, but it was their kind of hope and intention that any increases in council tax would be around in line with inflation. But neither of them could say that council tax wouldn't go up because of all of those pressures on council budgets that they're now encountering.
Which leads us nicely to the second string in your bow with this piece today, which is what all of this adds up to for Nigel Farage as Reform Prime Minister in number 10, potentially.
Yeah, and again, I think this is why I've have done quite a lot of work on looking at local authorities of all different political parties over the years. But I think there is, and Reform often says this, they say we're under much more scrutiny than other parties in local government. And I think the reason for that is because it's this sort of glimpse, a bit of an insight into how this still relatively new, fairly untested party actually governs, which is why it's getting quite a lot of attention. And it's worth noting that some of the things that they're talking about in local government, albeit that they are working in the context of, what they can and can't do with funding from government, the power, the services they have to provide, albeit that there are sort of echoes of what they're talking about for their programme in national government if they get there. So it is things like big efficiency drives. They've talked a lot about the civil service, about how government runs, about reducing the costs and the size of that. They've talked about lower taxes. Or, of course, we heard from Nigel Farage saying that they wouldn't be able to deliver the tax cuts that they'd talked about in their last sort of manifesto before the last election. They wouldn't be able to deliver that. They had to be realistic. But, there are sort of echoes of this programme that they say they can provide in local government and what they say they would want to provide if they were to get into Downing Street, which is why it kind of matters, because obviously the question is, can you actually do that? And talk to some think tank types and people that study this kind of stuff. And, there are some people saying they would encounter similar challenges if they were to get into number 10, which is the sort of broader financial backdrop and the way that public services operate. There are others that say it's absolutely right that Reform should look to find efficiencies and root out waste where there is waste to be had. But I think the reason all this is interesting is because it does give that kind of glimpse into Reform actually as a party of government, albeit local government at this stage.
Although it's interesting because you then talk to people who look at public opinion and say, well, do you know what? Reform aren't necessarily held to the same rules as the traditional political parties by people who are thinking about voting for them.
Yeah, that was really interesting. So this was Luke Trill, who's the director of More in Common, which is one of these companies that kind of measures public opinion. And what he was saying is that he thinks the reason, in his view, that people voted Reform at the local elections wasn't primarily to do with kind of local authority issues. It was that the reason that they're gaining traction and the reason that they're sitting at the top of the polls is primarily to do with issues about immigration and small boat crossings. And his argument that was, if Reform do or don't put up your council tax, or if Reform do or don't manage to find the savings that they said that they will in local government, he doesn't necessarily think that that's going to have a major influence on the outcome of the next general election. But it's also worth saying that he did say what might have an impact is if one of the councils that Reform runs has a sort of, bit of a crisis, whether it's like a crisis in social care or a crisis in bins. We've seen other local authorities that have really long-running bin strikes, or if one of them goes effectively bankrupt, which has happened to other councils that have been run by other parties. He's saying it might be that kind of thing that could dent Reform's public image, as it were. But he's saying these things about budgets, maybe less so. But I guess what it does do is give their opposition parties the opportunity to kind of point to their record in local government as they are campaigning against Reform, as they will do, of course, in the run-up to the next election. And also, Reform is on this quest, and they've been really upfront about it. So people like Danny Kruger, who, of course, switched from the Conservatives to become one of Reform's MPs, Nigel Farage himself, they've talked really openly about the fact they're aware that Reform has to kind of prove its credibility, that it's trying to professionalise as a party. Danny Kruger was talking about the pirate ship of Reform and he needs to turn it into His Majesty's Royal Navy ship ready for service. So I think they are conscious that they're under the spotlight, and their record in local government and how well they deliver on their promises is going to count in some degree towards the shape of the party heading into the next election.
One thing I wish Reform would reform is their website. And I speak as a journalist rather than as a normal person, because you click on there and you click on the section marked policies and you think, oh, maybe that's where I'll find Nigel Farage's speech from Monday where he set out, their new economic and public spending policy. And it's not there. But what is there is their old contract with you, with that picture of Nigel Farage in Downing Street with the sun behind him, the Star, not Sun, the newspaper. And it's with their old tax pledges.
Yeah.
So their website's incredibly out of date.
Yeah.
Niche complaint.
They are those tax pledges that Nigel Farage
junked
this week or last week?
This week on Monday.
Week. Yeah.
It's only Thursday and that was only on Monday.
Oh my goodness, it just goes. But yeah, exactly. They are the pledges that he said that they're not going to be able to stick to at the next election. I haven't actually looked at the website of Reform UK for a while. I'm not sure if
That's because you're doing it in real time with the real people. You don't need to look at the website.
Talking to lots and lots of people. But yeah.
Alex, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure as ever.